So what we're going to be looking at today is the NSIP action plan of the UK government. NSIPs were introduced following the Kate Barker proposals and reforms in the late 2000s, and resulting in the Planning Act 2008. And in those days, the Faustian pact that the government of the day was proposing between promoters and decision makers was that in return for a front-loaded application process, where applicants would resolve as many problems prior to application, they would get a certain and streamlined, slick process whereby they advanced to a decision and an implementable scheme at great speed. There was only one project, which it happens DLA Piper acted on, the Rookery project, that was under the original proposals. And that was a relatively swift project. There were only 30-odd questions asked of anyone in the whole process. It was nevertheless intensive. The client reflected with us that they liked it in comparison with the consenting processes that had gone before, because it was so much more certain. They could understand the timescales. They had more of a handle on cost because they knew how long things were going to take, and they knew what inputs were likely to be required. Now, some 15 years later since the Act, there is a little bit more of a sclerotic process. It's become more complicated. People have learned to operate the system, both as promoters and as other participants in the project. Now, that's resulted not necessarily in making it any quicker, and it has resulted in the process getting somewhat more involved. The decision-making is more complicated, and the paperwork is certainly more voluminous, which is not helped by the availability of electronic means of communication. So the government, earlier this year, February 2023, published its action plan for looking at NSIPs and speeding them up again. And it's looked at five areas in particular for action. Clear strategic direction in relation to infrastructure projects, operational reform for faster consenting, realising better outcomes for the natural environment, recognising the role of local communities and strengthening engagement, and system capability, making the machine work better. In July, they brought forward proposals which deal with three of those: operational reform, the role of local communities and stakeholders, and system capabilities. They brought forward proposals in relation to those, and a consultation that's recently closed. Why, you may say, talk about this now? And the answer is because there's still an opportunity to make comments if you wish to do so, and also because this is very much a live topic. And live to the extent that the Prime Minister's speech last night in relation to net zero touches on the very points that we are concerned with here. He said, we'll speed up planning for the most nationally significant infrastructure projects. So there's a class of projects that the government wants to see delivered even more swiftly. And he's looking at things such as the first ever spatial plan for an energy infrastructure, which is looking at that clear strategic direction for those first points. But what we're going to talk mostly about today are the nuts and bolts, the operational reforms, the things that PINs, the Planning Inspectorate, can do to make things swifter, and we'll be looking at how that can be made to run more smoothly or not, and whether the proposed reforms are likely to be effective. So taking the particular areas, and there are about 5 to half a dozen that have been brought forward, we're now going to think about the particular aspects of that. First of all, I'm going to turn to Claire, who, as I've said before, deals very much with the engagement between different players in the infrastructure space and managing interfaces, managing consultation. We're going to have a think about some of that pre-application consultation process and what the reforms have in mind. Claire, do you want to just sort of set the scene for us there?
Yeah, hi, morning everyone. So I'm going to talk to the proposals which relate to the pre-application stage and the consultation process. And what's coming out of the government's consultation is that the focus is on ensuring that the process is effective and proportionate, taking into account the scale and complexity of the project. as you'll be aware, there's no set time frame for how long consultation should go on for. And as a result, the consultation notes that evidence suggests that the pre-application stage is taking ever more time, which causes delay. But at the same time, throughout that process, there is a failure to identify and resolve key issues. And that has a knock-on effect once you get into the examination process. So the changes that I'm going to look at that are proposed, first of all, it's the introduction of a 3-tiered paid for pre-application service, which will be offered by PINS. The 3 tiers that they are proposing is a basic, standard, and enhanced tier of service. So for basic pre-application service, you're looking at focusing on low complexity, uncontroversial projects where there are going to be either no or limited compulsory acquisition powers sought, and where the potential examination issues are those which are frequently considered by examining authorities. The standard process is going to be for potentially any project, apart from those seeking fast track. And then the enhanced process is for those who are seeking fast track, or alternatively for projects which are complex or controversial and which need to identify and tackle complex issues. The basic process really does what it says on the tin. It's dealing with the nuts and bolts and the statutory minimum procedural advice. The standard and enhanced processes will include the provision of impartial advice from PINS on planning questions on a without prejudice basis, and also providing advice to support resolution of potential issues at examination. Now, the plan is for these services to be introduced from April next year, which isn't really far away. And applicants will be able to choose which support level they wish to use via discussions with PINS. And there's also talk of introducing a subscription service for 12 months. So effectively, during that period, the applicant has access to the service, and then at the end of that period, they can either choose to renew their service, or they can switch between different levels of services if that is deemed to be necessary. Later on in this session, we're going to talk about the fast track, so I'm going to hold off expressing some of my views on that until we get to that point of the talk.
Do you have a feel at this stage, Claire, for the types of project that might fall into each of the service levels? So if clients were interested, what sorts of projects might fall into each of the buckets there?
Yeah, so for basic, as I said, that's intended on projects which are low complexity and uncontroversial. And that may be the type of project which just tips into the NSIP regime, I would say, something like a solar park, which finds itself in the Planning Act system because of the generating capacity, where you've got a site where perhaps there's already control over the land which is required, there's no compulsory acquisition being sought, and it's purely finding itself in this process because it tips over the threshold. I think the thing that's a little bit uncertain is obviously you've got the enhanced process, which is linked to fast track, and it's going to be interesting to see how many projects want to get into that service in order to try and benefit from that procedure.
Yes, and we'll look at that a bit later. Do you want to go on about what you were explaining just now?
Yeah, so I was going to talk about there is going to be greater clarity provided for applicants on who to consult and when. So the current list of statutory consultees is from 2009 and needs updating. And that is going to be updated to reflect name changes which have taken place. For example, Highways England moving to National Highways, remove bodies which no longer exist, and also adding parties which are essential to the delivery of infrastructure. And that is intended to help applicants know who to engage with at the right time. And then we're also going to the proposals for the introduction of an adequacy of consultation milestone. And this is to address a concern that over time consultation has increased and increased. It's become disproportionate and is no longer focused on what the actual complexity of the scheme is. And as a result, everyone who's involved in that process, whether it's applicants, consultees, or local communities, can find themselves dealing with a bit of consultation fatigue, and it can also lead to delays and increased costs. So this new milestone is going to be embedded in the pre-application service. And applicants, authorities and PINs will assess the adequacy of proposed consultation early in the process to provide greater clarity over what's proportionate, and to give more certainty to developers as to what they need to do going forward. And it's also intended to limit the burden on local communities. We've been promised that we'll see updated guidance which sets out the criteria for assessing whether the milestone's been reached. And other pre-application guidance is also going to be revised and updated to support a shift in focus to identifying and resolving key issues early on in the pre-application process, and what the content and standard of application should be. And I think what I would say in response to all of this regarding the further clarification on consultation is that it will be welcome, so that it's a bit clearer for applicants as to what they're going into and what they need to do. But I think one thing that we've all seen in practice is that what's really important in the consultation process is ensuring that an applicant is properly engaging with affected parties in order to properly understand the issues that they have with the scheme, and to try and tackle them and resolve them at the earliest point, not once you're in the middle of an examination process.
Yeah, I think doesn't it go back to that Faustian pact I was talking about, which is that you front load your process in order to resolve issues. And the key point is not so much the quality of the consultation, because that can, to an extent, excuse a position where controversy remains between parties. At least you know you have consulted properly, you've got balanced views from both sides. And we'll look at principal areas of dispute and their role. But on the other hand, you may still have matters at large. And I think the other thing I'd reflect on is you talked about the varying levels of advice. And if you had the basic level and you didn't take substantive advice from the inspectorate on how you would consult, and then controversy remains, then that is going to be reflected in the likelihood of passing the adequacy of consultation gateway, perhaps. And so, if you were taking a risk with consultation, then that's how problems arise. And there are instances, we know, I think, of where consultation has been a matter of consideration. So the inspectorate expressed its views on that in relation to the Lower Thames Crossing case, for instance, and that was one where adequacy of consultation was brought up in the acceptance process. So I think that then takes us on looking at those advice levels to Michael's observations on the operational reforms and fast track, and how that element of the system can be made to make things move more quickly. And no doubt Clay will chip in if there are items remaining from your observations that influence what Michael's looking at. Michael, where are we in relation to fast track and operational reform?
Yeah, it's probably worth just reflecting briefly on the nature of the system as it currently is. As you pointed out, however, one of the benefits, I guess, of the NSIP system is one of certainty, that you know what your process is going to be, how long it's going to take, and from that roughly how much it's going to cost. But I suppose the other side to that is essentially what we have is an NSIP process and procedure which uses essentially the same system for all sorts of different types of projects, because NSIPs can be really quite straightforward. I mean, Claire mentioned that the energy project that just creeps across the threshold for a DCO. So you've got that sort of project. And on the other hand, you can have very complex linear infrastructure schemes, which can involve large amounts of compulsory purchase, lots of objectors. So I guess one of the difficulties maybe at the moment is that what you've got is a system which applies fairly strict deadlines and processes for a wide variety of projects, but it doesn't necessarily have a great deal of flexibility in terms of how it operates. And although we've got effectively a maximum 6-month examination process, what seems to have tended to happen is that even for the relatively more straightforward projects, what might be thought to be more straightforward projects, the amount of work involved in the examination seems to have grown exponentially over time, and more questions being asked by the examining authority, so that everything seems to just take the full 6-month period. So I guess what the consultation is seeking to do is think about how can we make both the pre-examination and examination process more efficient, also more proportionate to the project that we're talking about, hence gives more flexibility to the examining authority.
And also about making sure the examining authority knows more about the project before it makes key decisions.
Correct. So we've got, if you like, general operational reforms, and part of that is this concept of introducing the option of a fast-track route for consent. So in terms of the operational reforms, Claire's already mentioned one of the main ideas being this 3-level pre-application service, and I'll come back and talk about that a bit more in a minute. We've also got proposed ability for the inspector from the examining authority being able to come into the pre-examination process and assist in terms of pre-application advice, so that there's a kind of crossover between those pre-examination and examination processes.
A bit like a trial judge being involved in the directions stage of litigation.
Yeah, so you can see that can potentially be helpful just in terms of having a consistency in approach, I suppose, between the various parts of the process. I think one of the interesting ideas is at the moment there are various stages of representations, and we've got what we call relevant representations at the pre-application stage, which at the moment can be a fairly short statement of the principal grounds of objection, but doesn't necessarily give the applicant a lot of notice of what the details of that objection actually are. And then that gets developed during the examination at the written representation stage. So that can involve delay because it just can take a wee while for the parties, the examining authority and the applicant, to understand what the representation is actually all about.
Yeah,
so
I mean, it's where the pre-examination relevant representation stage, you're supposed to use just a summary, aren't you? And then it might well be that there's quite a substantive concern for an objector, and the applicant doesn't find out for maybe over a month.
Yeah, I mean that can be
substance
down the line. Yes, so that's not necessarily greatly beneficial to the efficient running of the examination. So one of the principal proposed reforms is that there'll be an onus on those making representations to set out as much detail about their case at the pre-examination stage. So effectively what we're trying to do is front load everything so that everything becomes clear, and that again becomes important when we're talking particularly about fast track process. So again, that's probably helpful, although we say there will be cases where there might be limited opportunity to do that because the representation may be along the lines that, well, nobody's spoken to us, we don't know what this is all about. So you can't really do that, but nevertheless, probably helpful. And the other general...
I think you'd observe as well, wouldn't you, that if you're the applicant, you've really got to take the opportunity that gives. And if somebody gives you a much better idea of where things are, you'd better engage at that stage so that you're going into the examination proper with as much resolved as possible.
Well, indeed so, and obviously the downside, if you don't do that, then the problem is it all stacks up later on. I mean, I just got a result of an examination last night that I was involved in where there really wasn't, frankly, engagement from the applicant pre-examination, not a lot of engagement through the process, and effectively a lot of the examination of the issues in dispute really ended up right at the end and went right up to the end, the last deadline, which is really not ideal.
And you won, didn't you?
Yes, well, there is that. Yeah. Well,
I was going to say, Michael, I think I agree with you that in theory it sounds like a great idea to front load all of that process, but I think certainly having seen how this might work at the coalface, the problem I foresee with this is that what we're assuming is that the applicant engages openly, fully with statutory consultees, such that they have the information they need to be able to respond effectively, to provide the information at the early stage. Because don't forget, at a relevant representation stage, the application's been submitted. So if this was properly front-loaded into the pre-application stage and statutory consultees were given all the information they needed to respond by a well-organised applicant, provided the right information at the right times, that and the statutory consultees were appropriately resourced, that's how it would work effectively. I think that there are problems at the operational level with all of that fitting together. I think that often with applications that I've seen responding to, applicants don't provide that information, and it isn't as smooth as it should be.
And I suppose that I think there's also going to be new guidance coming out as well. I suppose you can anticipate that along with the changes to the legislative context, that guidance might be encouraging applicants just along the lines that you just said, Ross, that for this to work efficiently, the applicant's got to make the information properly available to relevant consultees, and then got to engage and try and reach agreement. It's not just about ticking the box of consultation. There's a purpose to consultation in terms of actually engaging with those issues and trying to resolve the issues as efficiently as possible within the examination.
Yeah,
I think Michael. So go ahead, Ross.
I was going to say, particularly with issues like compulsory purchase, I've seen examples where applicants haven't engaged on land acquisition at all, and they've just proceeded on the basis that they're going to use compulsory purchase powers, and they've not spoken to the relevant landowners up until the point of submission, which I think is not how the system is supposed to work.
And that would hopefully be weeded out by Claire's adequacy of consultation gateway. But Michael, a lot of this, I think, feeds then into the fast track process, and it's the appropriateness for different types of project. And we've had a comment about whether different types of project truly belong in the NSIP process, and we'll come back to that perhaps later at this time. But Michael, the next really big point is the fast track process, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's a general flexibility given for examining authorities to set timescales. So we're kind of maybe move a little bit more away from the fixed timescale things and more proportionality linked to this particular type of development concern. But yes, the most interesting thing here is this idea of a fast track process. I mean, in general terms, the idea is that you have an expedited procedure from acceptance through to a final decision of a target of 12 months. That's the idea. And then within this, you have a shorter examination. The moment the maximum examination is 6 months, and the idea is that will go down to 4 for fast track proposals. And yet you also have more constrained timeframes for the examining authority preparing the report and for the Secretary of State making a decision. So again, all with the idea of this all happening within 12 months. In terms of what sort of cases would be suitable for fast track, the principal test that's been proposed is that there are limited, we've touched on this already, limited principal areas of disagreement. So essentially that I suppose that you have a limited number of anticipated grounds of objection. There'll be a requirement for the applicant to clearly articulate this. Again, that's picking up on this point of the need for an applicant to engage at the pre-application stage to understand properly what the issues are and to demonstrate that those are issues which are capable of being resolved, hopefully, within that 4-month examination period. So that's if you like the principal area, and again I suppose it's kind of going back to what Claire was saying, the sort of obvious things that you might think of as being suitable for that sort of fast track process. The limited area of disagreement might be the kind of energy development just creeps across the threshold type case. That's that seems to my mind that's the obvious sort of case that we're talking about here. But the tests are not just limited to limited principal areas of disagreement. There's quite a lot of work, it would seem, that an applicant will need to do to demonstrate to PINS that their case is one which is suitable for fast track. So they've got to, right at the start of the application and process, and before they start the consultation, they would have to prepare a program management document, which will essentially need to set out what the application is all about, why they think this is sort of application that won't generate loads of objections, why those objections will be capable of being resolved, and what their program would be for seeking to resolve all of those. So it's potentially, quite a lot of project management that the applicant will need to do and program that in, and they have to consult on this as well. So it's almost like a quasi additional consultation process as well.
I think from where I look at that, if you invest all of this time and effort in process management plan and in engaging with people, and then you reach application stage, and the principal areas of disagreement revealed by the objectors, over which you have no control, remain complex. You can't get them to be less complex because they just are. You may have invested all of that effort with minimal benefit.
Yes, and the other thing is, and again, Claire's picked up on this already, that if you're going to if you want to sign up to a fast track proposal, then you also need to sign up to the enhanced pre-application service, which is the most expensive level of service. And that, there is a sort of slight oddness to this, in that the enhanced service is being used apparently for two quite different purposes. One where you've got a really complicated scheme with lots of objections and lots of things to manage, and the other one where it's for fast track, which conceptually would be for the more simple type of objections. So there seems to be a slight dichotomy there, which is maybe a little bit odd.
So thinking about what the Prime Minister was saying last night, and speeding up planning for the most nationally significant projects, the largest, most complex ones, you may end up having to proceed with an enhanced service level, but your prospects of getting into the fast track for really big linear project, electricity project, gas, transport, something like that, is minimal. So it's focused upon making the process better rather than necessarily very much faster. That's
right. Whereas I suppose the idea of the use of that enhanced service for a fast track is to try and manage the process so that you get rid of those objections, manage those objections, and make the process run as smoothly as possible, I suppose. But there is a lot of work, a lot of onus on the applicant to make this work, and I suppose that raises the question as to how attractive is the fast track actually going to be. I mean, you're going to save some time, maybe, in
the examination process, but arguably it might take longer to get that process started.
Yeah, I suppose that's the thing. Are you just shifting deck chairs around in the sense that you're saving time at the examination, but you're having to do more re-examination? And are you really saving money because you have to do more work early on? So it's a question of how attractive is saving a few months in the examination process actually compared to the potential extra work that might be involved at other stages.
And I think what I'd observed, looking back to ancient history again, we were involved in one of the really early projects as an objector, and that was the Bacon Factory Curve Network Rail project in Ipswich. Now that had something like a 4.5 to 5 month examination period anyway, and that was simply because it was a straightforward project that was well managed by the examining authority. And there's nothing to stop an examining authority doing things in a slick and swift way now. The question is whether the examining authorities are tempted to make it more complex because of what they're looking at. And then, Ross, you might have observations on this. There have been some pilot projects that looked at accelerating the decision making or the examination process. And then there's a question about whether those actually achieved material change in terms of speed for the process.
I think that's right. I think the pilots that we've seen haven't necessarily shaved off significant time from the process, albeit there may have been complex projects that would not necessarily have been the ones that ought to have been piloted. But yeah, and it goes to one of the questions that we've been asked as well in the chat, which is surely we should be looking at more legal methods of reducing the timescales, like environmental assessment or habitats regulations assessment and things like that, to sort of reduce the process, the timescales involved, as opposed to, as Michael says, moving deck chairs around at the examination stage. Yeah,
and that I think, I mean, a few months can be valuable in terms of the price of steel, but it's difficult to plan for that. It's tempting to put the most glamorous projects into the fast track process, but in practice they may be suitable for an enhanced service level, but perhaps not the fast track process. Ross, you've been considering the planning skills, the funding, those aspects of the process and what that might mean for projects. Do you want to just share some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, of course. So I think as has been alluded to throughout the session so far, the system has become more sclerotic. There are more and more complex projects being submitted to the system. Policy statements are increasingly aged in some areas of the sectors that we deal in. And we're seeing increased projects being submitted, particularly in the energy space and soon to be probably in the water sector as well, given that the Water Resources NPS was designated on the 18th of September, I think, so 3 days ago.
Pretty recent, yeah.
So the picture there is of a system of complexity and increased resource having to be put into the system to resource the projects that are coming forward. So part of the proposed reforms in this consultation process are towards the funding of the Planning Inspectorate and also public statutory consultees who engage on projects and DCO applications in general. So turning first, I think, to the proposed reforms for the funding of the Planning Inspectorate. What was interesting to me, I think, when I was looking at this, is that less than 70% of the costs that are incurred by the Planning Inspectorate in the examination of a DCO are recovered in application fees. So there's a gap effectively that is going to increase.
The taxpayer is subsidising DCO applications.
Exactly. So this is seeking to really reform that and to allow the funding of the Planning Inspectorate to grow naturally, so that it can increase recruitment and retention of staff. So that, I mean, they're looking to recruit 40 to 50 additional inspectors and case officers. So that just shows you, I think, that the anticipated growth in this sector from their workload perspective. So
that's going to be important, isn't it? If you need people who understand the system and understand the process. If you're going to be giving pre-application advice, for instance, you need the right people.
Absolutely. So the consultation really proposes the following measures to assist with funding Planning Inspectorate properly. So they're looking to increase existing application fees and introduce new charges. For example, new charges might relate to late submissions or for extended pre-examination periods for more complex schemes, both of which happen on a routine basis. So it's going to push up the fees there.
So it's also that's using nudge theory of economics, isn't it? That's the inspectorate saying, make sure your application is ready, otherwise we'll charge you for the privilege of changing it.
Yeah, no, definitely, and it's also expected that the pre-application fees, which is the bulk of the fee that you pay to the Planning Inspectorate, is going to go up from sort of between 79,000 at the higher end to 200,000, covering a 12-month period. And additional fees will also apply in the application, pre-examination, examination, and then the later stages of the process as well. So all in all, there is going to be at least a doubling of the fees paid to PINs as part of an application, and there will also be charges incurred for the expanded services that PINs offer to applicants, including the three-tiered planning application service that Claire was alluding to in the session as well.
How much of the value of a project do you think that represents? What does the consultation tell us on that? So
at the moment, and obviously fees are still charged at the moment, just in a reduced capacity. At the moment, Planning Inspectorate fees really only account for between 0.1 and 0.3% of overall project costs. So nominal in the scheme of things, but and even if they were to double, this is going to have a pretty negligible effect for most applicants, I think. And it will see some real benefits, particularly with regard to the efficiency of the process and the ability to resource it. So I think this is a really good thing. I think the funding gets interesting when you look at statutory consultees. So statutory consultees play a critical role in the examination of development consent orders. Yeah, so yeah, of course. So you've got Natural England, Historic England, Environment Agency, and National Highways in many cases. So they often bring critical technical support and advice to applicants on issues within their overall specialism and jurisdiction. So, and many of these organisations are required to participate in a substantial number of development consent order examinations, and including a disproportionate number of applications having been clustered to affect a relatively small number of local authorities, for example. The proposals really are looking to enhance the service that is offered by statutory consultees by allowing public authorities, and that is a defined term in legislation, in a bill that's coming forward, the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, to provide a better service and to fund them appropriately through the pre-application and examination stages. So the proposals include service level agreements between the applicant and statutory consultees, basically guaranteeing key performance indicators, response times, the number of staff that will be involved, and the information provided, the advice provided in a timely manner. But also the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill will introduce at section 129 a new section 54A of the Planning Act, which will allow a prescribed list of statutory consultees to charge for certain services in relation to DCO applications. So it is going to allow the charging of fees in relation to relevant services which capture statutory and non-statutory engagement across the full consenting process. And at this stage, we think that is broad enough to encompass things like legal fees, planning fees, and technical support from expert disciplines like hydrology or geotechnical work. So that is a good thing for the public authorities concerned. So that will probably capture people like National Highways, the Environment Agency, Historic England, Natural England, the Marine Management Organisation, the typical government expert bodies that are usually involved in this process, and local authorities as well.
It effectively puts them in the same position, or removes doubt about them being in the same position that you would be if you were a private landowner and you are negotiating with a promoter and you say, well, look, I'll engage with you if you'll pay for me to engage with you, or a private company in the same situation. So it's putting that beyond doubt, isn't it? What do you think that means in terms of cost for applicants? Because these are people who might not have charged for these services previously.
Absolutely, and in a lot of cases didn't charge for them. So I think from an applicant's perspective, it's likely to increase the quality of the application and certainly the efficiency of the process for them, particularly where you have that service level agreement in place, like a planning performance agreement, effectively. Speed of delivery and all of that is likely to be part of that. But I do think that the cost aspect of it could be prohibitive, and for certain schemes that are promoted by public authorities, for example, it could affect the viability of the scheme, where you have a large number of these organisations that have a requirement to be involved quite intensively. No doubt it's going to push the cost of the project up significantly.
But there's a certain sort of linking with all of this, and goes right back to what Claire was saying at the beginning. If you're going to have this enhanced pre-application consultation, there's going to be a cost to reducing controversy, which then feeds into what Michael's saying. The principal areas of disagreement are diminished. I mean, there's a suggestion in the chat that you could have non-objections, but you could have a zero principal area of disagreement, so that you're able to indicate that a project is green-lit to go forward. But there'll be a cost to something being green-lit through the process.
Yeah, so I was just going to pick up on that issue of cost a little bit from the applicant's perspective. And again, thinking about the energy development that just creeps across the threshold, and potentially here there can be quite significantly different costs involved with, say, a solar development for 40 megawatts and one for 50. If you've got a situation where an applicant could be required to pay for statutory consultee involvement with the NSIP project, but they're not required to do that planning application. And what does that mean for particularly energy development and net zero targets? Does it act as a disincentive potentially for larger scale energy schemes? I suppose.
Or it produces a tiered position, doesn't it, where you've got projects that are below 50 megawatts, so that it's 50 megawatts for onshore electricity generation. A sub 50 megawatt project is under the Town Country Planning Act 1990. The engagement requirements are relatively benign. You then move up to a scale of project for it to work, where perhaps a promoter's financial model has to be able to absorb the costs of the NSIP process and these enhanced costs in order to make it deliverable. So you get the very large projects, and those can work well within this project. The difficulty lies in those which are below the very large scale and above the 50 megawatt scale, because there you have to calibrate what you're going to expect in terms of consultation costs charged by statutory consultees, in terms of the price that you're going to have to pay in terms of basic, standard or enhanced process through PINs, and all of those costs are going to affect that sort of middle range of project. And so it affects a particular class of project and scale of project.
Yeah,
I suppose it goes.
Exactly the point. Yeah,
I think it goes as well to how these charges will be levied. Will it be through PPA style agreements with each statutory consultee, in which case the costs can be managed appropriately by reference to the complexity of the scheme? Or will it be through a charging schedule type approach that each undertaker or consultee put in place dependently, where there is less control really over that?
Yeah. So there's an interesting question, literally just in the chat on this, and do send questions in using the chat function, the Q&A function on this webinar. And that question is about whether there are plans to simplify or streamline making changes to existing DCOs, non-material changes and material changes. Now, Michael, I think you have something to say on that.
Yeah, not too much to say, but a little bit. Yes, there is. I think it's been acknowledged that the current process for making non-material changes to DCOs post consent isn't really necessarily working that well. That these processes are taking anything up to 16 months to determine, and a lot of time is spent debating the materiality of the proposed changes. So the post-consent changes process is being reviewed, with the idea being that there will be a standardized process for giving advice about the likely materiality of changes, and introducing a statutory timeframe for decision making on non-material change applications. So that's so hopefully that will help. That would say that's non-material changes. It doesn't seem there's a proposed change to material changes, and as I understand, there's only really been one such proposed change in any event.
That was Hinkley Point C power station, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think those changes will assist, but I guess also it probably goes back to the question of thinking when the DCO has been drafting in the first place about trying to what flexibility might be needed for the project, and trying to build that in to avoid the need for either material or non-material changes. Obviously, that's not always possible, but there are ways in which you can try and preempt this issue and build in flexibility into the DCO itself.
I think that's something as well that the Inspectorate is proposing as part of and is mentioned in the consultation. The Inspectorate is proposing to provide better guidance on what is acceptable in terms of deviation, in terms of flexibility, and in terms of the Rochdale envelope, because that's the critical point, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, if you can get your consent structured in such a way that it gives you the flexibility that you need for the elements where you're not entirely sure how you're going to build something out, but gives you enough. That's the point. It gives you enough certainty to be able to do the Rochdale envelope and to be able to assess what the impacts are to allow your consent to be granted in those terms, and that's suppose got to be the ideal way forward.
And that helps, doesn't it, in terms of focus? It all goes back to that pre-application process, and the onus to an extent being on the promoter, the developer, to think about what certainty they require, and to really think ahead. Am I ready for my project? Do I need to go all the way to feed in order to make my application or beyond, so that I'm comfortable that I'm not going to have to change things later and get stuck in a statutory process that I didn't anticipate?
Well, or indeed, we've had experience of that sort of issue emerging during the examination as well, which also is quite difficult to manage. So I mean, it's also what level of detail do you need to go to, I suppose, in terms of the engineering to understand how your project will be built, because that can impact on land take. It can impact on how you describe the works that you're going to undertake, and that will probably vary, I suppose, between different types of projects. That's the level of engineering detail that you need to go into. But sometimes it might be necessary to go into that at a much earlier stage and into a greater level of detail than you might necessarily anticipate.
And I think it makes it incumbent on developers as they run towards application, and it's always a frantic dash, as you run towards application, to just take stock and think, well, I'm hoping for a 4-month examination period and an accelerated decision-making period, although note that the greatest extension in time. So there's never ever been an extension of an examination, but there have been many extensions of decision-making periods, including one now, which we've been involved in, where the decision-making period has extended over several years. But it's about the thought: am I going to have to change my project? Is it likely to need, in light of the input I'm getting as I move towards implementation, and I know I'm going to have to deal with when I get to build it, Do I really believe I'm going to be a four-month project, or do I think I'm actually better to say to the inspectorate, I know I was saying 4 months, but the safest thing is to say 6 months? And I think
that's the problem. Yeah, I think this is the problem. If you may think at the start it's a 4-month project, but then it turns out when you start doing the consultation that you may have to make tweaks, and you just if you're giving for 4 months, there's not going to be enough time in that examination to make those changes if that's what you need to do. But I guess it's all about scoping things out right at the start, and understanding your application, understanding what the issues are, and what you need to do to scope those out.
Yes, and there's a suggestion in the chat that there may have been an extended examination in the Derby Junctions case. We'll have a quick check of that, but even so, it is only one among the many, and projects such as the Thames Tideway Tunnel was not extended, even though it was a very large and complex scheme, and it was requested to be extended, and the examining authority on that said no, because the government has always actually held to the duration of examination periods. And I think the 4-month period is being looked at as a statutory period. So if you are in the 4-month period, you may find that you are enhancing jeopardy for your project if you are going to become more controversial later. If you know that you've got built in a design change or a design review or the appointment of a consultant or contractor, which could result in a change to your project.
Yeah.
Okay. This is we're moving towards a close now, I think, and I'll just turn to colleagues to just give a final reflection in relation to the proposals, and to just reflect on whether they are likely to see light of day, bearing in mind we are hurtling towards a general election sometime over the next 12 months. So Claire, do you have any sort of closing remarks?
On whether we expect to see these come into force, or on the consultation as a whole?
Yeah.
Generally, I feel like I can see that there is a benefit to some of the changes that are proposed in terms of improving the system that we have, but I question whether there was a chance, it's been a missed opportunity to have more of a rethink as to how this process works, full stop, rather than just tinkering at the edges.
Yeah. So Michael?
Yeah, I suppose two points. I think. I suppose I've got a concern about how this process, particularly with additional costs involved, is going to impact on particularly energy consents for the sorts of that mid-tier energy consent we're talking about. I suppose the second point, I guess, was just they're trying to simplify things and trying to make things more proportionate, but it does seem to me doing it in a very quick legalistic way still. And I guess I wonder whether it might be easier just to give the examining authority just generally more flexibility in how they deal with these things, frankly.
Ross?
Yeah, I would completely agree. I think as Claire said, it's a missed opportunity in some respects. But I'm concerned with how parasitic some of the changes that are proposed are on the LURB, and the likelihood of that coming through in this parliamentary session.
That bill's controversial for many other reasons, isn't it?
Exactly. So whether or not that gets pushed into the next post-election, which and then whether it survives, yeah.
So some skepticism there. For my own part, I think that this will be beneficial generally. It does have some real opportunities. I think that it's a process which was originally intended to be non-controversial, non-adversarial, and involve lawyers as little as possible. You'll note that it is lawyers who are talking to you about it now, so you can form your own judgment on whether that's been successful. My own belief is that we'll be looking at this again in 5 years' time. My name's Howard Basford. I'm the UK Head of Infrastructure, Construction and Transportation at DLA Piper. Thank you very much for joining us today. If you have other questions, if you'd like to talk about nationally significant infrastructure projects or planning generally, do get in touch with us. Our email addresses are available. You can find us on the web. Thank you very much for joining us today, and have a good afternoon.